Hi, this is Intermediate Music Theory, lesson number 7, and we're going to talk about specific intervals today. So in the previous lesson, we talked about generic intervals, which are just the distance between notes as written on the staff without taking into consideration accidentals, sharps or flats. And this time we're going to talk about specific intervals, which is going to take generic intervals one step further, and we're going to now figure out the exact distances between two notes, including accidentals. So let's dive into this lesson. This is in musictheory.net, and we're going to go to the specific intervals lesson under the intervals category. So let's take a look. Right, so specific intervals are measured taking into consideration both the location on the staff, but also in half steps on the keyboard. So we're actually going to count the number of half steps now to figure out this very exact distance between two notes. We learned in the previous lesson then C to D and C to D flat are both generic seconds, right? Because we have gone from the first ledger line to the next space in both cases. So that's a generic second. The second example is a D flat, but because we weren't taking into consideration flats in generic intervals, it was still a second. Now, in this case, though, if you notice, the first example is a whole step, is 2 half steps, but the second example is just 1 half step, right, from C to D flat, right? So that's only half step. So we have to take that into consideration because the actual distance between those two intervals in pitch is going to be different because they're different number of half steps, and you can hear it when I play it on the keyboard. If we go from C natural to C and D flat, all right. So they're written in the same place in the staff, but one is a whole step and the other one is a half step. So we got to take that into consideration when we deal with specific intervals. So let's take a look. We're going to start with the major intervals, and we're going to use major intervals. We're also going to use other terms like minor to kind of measure the specific distance between them. But we'll start with the major intervals. So the first major interval is the major second. The major second is going to be 2 half steps. This is also a whole step. 2 half steps is the same thing as a whole step, and a whole step is, in this case, when we talk about intervals, the way that this is written, it's a major second. So the distance between C natural and D natural is 2 half steps. So that's going to be a major second. Let's listen to that. Okay. Same thing with E to F sharp. That's going to be another major second. We have 1 half step, 2 half steps. Let's listen. Okay, and just take a note that they're written still 1 apart in the staff, so they're seconds, but because we're now taking into consideration the accidentals, rather the number of half steps, we're now being specific that it's a major second. If we move on to the next position, we're going to talk about thirds. So a major third is made up of 4 half steps. So we've skipped 3 half steps. We're going to talk about that later. We're going to talk about 4 half steps first, which is a major third. So from C to E, the generic interval was a third, right? Because we have line, space, line. But we're also going to talk about the number of half steps, which is 4. So we have C 1, 2, 3, 4 half steps. Let's listen to that. Okay. So E to G sharp is also a major third. We go from E, we skip F, we go to G. So the position on the staff is a third, but we also measure 4 half steps here. So let's listen to that. Okay, moving on, we have a perfect fourth. So fourths is the first example of what's called a perfect interval. And there are a few perfect intervals, and we're going to cover them next. But the first perfect interval is the perfect fourth. There's actually, I mean, this lesson doesn't talk about it, but I might as well mention it now. The unison or the prime interval and generic interval, but the unison, when it's exactly the same pitch, is the first perfect interval. And that would be if you have, say, D and then another D natural next to it. That's a unison. It's the same exact pitch. It's also written in the same place in the staff. So just keep that in mind. That's a perfect interval as well. But let's talk about perfect fourth now. The perfect fourth is 5 half steps. And the first example is C to F natural. C natural to F natural is a perfect fourth. So it's a fourth because we go line, space, line, space. That's fourth. And it's also 5 half steps. So let's listen to that. Okay? Another perfect fourth is F natural to B flat. All right? Next interval is the perfect fifth. Here's another perfect interval. The perfect fifth is made up of 7 half steps. So we've skipped 6 half steps. We've gone from 5 to 7 here in this case. The perfect fifth is 7 half steps. And the first example is C to G. So this is a fifth. And also 7 half steps makes it a perfect fifth specifically. So let's listen to CG. And another example is B natural to F sharp. So in this case, we have a fifth, generic fifth here, as you can see by the distance on the staff. But the sharp makes it 7 half steps. And 7 half steps is the specific distance for a perfect fifth. So let's listen to a B natural F sharp perfect fifth. And I'm going to take a side note and mention all of the intervals that we've been covering so far have been in ascending or going up. So just be mindful of that. That's kind of an important thing to note. Because if it was going in a different direction, it would actually be... if we were going down to an F sharp under, it would be different, okay? But we're going up. Okay, the next interval we're going to talk about is the major sixth. The major sixth is going to be a generic sixth that's 9 half steps. So we've skipped 8 half steps for now, and we're going to 9 half steps. The ones that we're skipping now, we're going to see soon. So C to A is a major sixth, C natural to A natural specifically. It's a generic sixth as far as the staff distance, but it's also a specific major sixth because it's 9 half steps. Let's listen. Okay. Another major sixth is E flat to C natural. Okay. And the next major interval is the major seventh. Is 11 half steps. So the first example is C to B natural. This is a generic seventh based on the position on the staff, but it's also a major seventh, the specific interval, because of it has 11 half steps. Let's listen to that. Another major seventh is D natural to C sharp. Okay. And finally, the perfect eighth or the perfect octave is 12 half steps, and it is a generic eighth because of the position of the staff, but the fact that this one is 12 half steps from C natural to C natural also makes it a perfect eighth or a perfect octave. So I want to mention that the perfect eighth is a little bit related to the unison because, for example, let me pull up the keyboard. The perfect eighth is the distance between C and the next C on the keyboard, right? Same thing with like D. Now, the unison would be if you just play the same key twice, right? So it's the same, this one's the same C4. So the unison and the perfect eighth and the perfect eighth or the perfect octave are kind of related. So just keep that in mind. All right, so we've been talking about major intervals. We're gonna and perfect intervals. We're gonna talk about minor intervals next. And we did this idea of major and perfect and minor intervals is what we refer to as the quality of the interval. So seconds, thirds, and sixths and seventh can have major quality. So the only ones. Firsts, fourths, and fifths and eighths use the perfect name instead. All right. So let's talk about minor intervals. So when we get to these, we're gonna start talking about all those combinations of half steps that we skipped before. So a minor interval is going to be 1/2 step less than a major interval. So we're gonna take that major interval, or we're gonna bring it down 1/2 step, and we're gonna end up with a minor interval. So in this case, for example, we have C natural and E flat. And as you can see, this is a generic third, but because we have 3 half steps this time instead of 4 like we had in the major third, now with 3 half steps, we end up with a minor third. Let's listen to that. Okay, so remember that the major third would have sounded like this. The minor thirds now is going to be 3 half steps. But it's still a third generically because the distance on the staff is the same. But now we're accounting for that flat that we didn't have before in the major third. Okay? Another minor third is E to G natural. Remember that in the major example, G was sharp, and that made it 4 half steps. Now we have 3 half steps, so that's a minor third. So minor intervals go from transform from major intervals. So only seconds, thirds, sixths, and seventh can be minor, just like only seconds, thirds, sixths, and seventh could be major. Okay, let's talk about augmented. So an augmented interval has 1 more half step than a perfect interval. This is the initial introduction of the augmented. It's going to deal with changing changing the perfect interval into a half step bigger. You will see that augmented can be used in other ways too, but for now we're just going to talk about how the augmented interval is just raising a perfect interval by a half step. So we're not going to use major interval when we're raising the perfect interval. Okay? So for example, C and F natural will be a perfect fourth, or 5 semitones. But C to F sharp is an augmented fourth. So C and F natural would have been a perfect fourth, but that extra half step of the F sharp makes it an augmented fourth. 6 half steps. Okay, it's still a generic fourth because of the location on the staff, but we're now accounting for that at sharp. So we're going from a perfect fourth to an augmented fourth. F natural to B natural is also an augmented fourth. It's a generic fourth because of the location of the staff, but this is no longer a perfect fourth because it's 6 semitones or 6 half steps. Let's listen to that. Now the perfect fourth would have been F to B flat, but the augmented fourth would be that. So major intervals can now be augmented by adding a half step. So we can talk about augmenting major intervals as well by adding a half step to that. So you take a major interval, you add a half step, you end up with augmented. So we can also use the term augmented to deal with making major intervals bigger by a half step, just like we did that with perfect intervals. So let's make an example. C natural to the next A sharp. C natural to A natural would have been a major sixth. It would have been 9 half steps. But C to A sharp is 10 half steps. So we're taking that generic sixth, and then we had a major sixth, which was A natural, and now A sharp is an augmented sixth. You see? So let's listen to that. Okay, And now let me take a side note and explain the reason why generic intervals are important is because if you see A sharp can also be spelled as B flat, right? And B flat would be the same distance. You see, it would still be 10 semitones, 10 half steps. But in that context, we couldn't have called it a sixth, a generic sixth, because we'd be in the B line, this line right here. We would then have a distance of a seventh on the staff as far as a generic interval is concerned. So where is written the staff, we're still taking that into consideration. But now, because of that, we're making this an augmented sixth. We wouldn't call that a seventh. Okay, so just be mindful of that. So the next example of an augmented sixth is a D flat to B natural. It's 10 half steps, 10 semitones, and also a generic sixth as written on the staff. Okay. We're going to talk about diminished now. So a diminished interval has one less half step than a perfect interval. So just like augmenting a perfect interval made it bigger or like wider by a half step, diminishing the perfect interval is going to make it smaller or shorter by a half step. For example, C natural to G flat is going to be a diminished fifth. That's going to be 6 half steps, but because C to G natural before would have been a perfect fifth, G flat, we're lowering that perfect fifth by a half step. We end up with a diminished fifth. And because we're taking into consideration the location of the staff, this would be called a diminished fifth. It could never be called, as written here, an augmented fourth. An augmented fourth would have to be written as F sharp. F sharp and G flat are the same pitch, but the spelling is different. So we're taking into consideration where it's written on the staff. That's why this is a diminished fifth and not an augmented fourth. Okay? Now, the diminished fifth and the augmented fourth, in terms of sound, sounds exactly the same. In terms of pitch, in terms of the actual distance of pitch, it's exactly the same. But when we take into consideration how it's written, we're going to call it something else. So just be mindful of that. Let's listen to this diminished fifth. So you see, it sounds the same as the augmented fourth. But in this case, this was F sharp. And in this case, this was G flat. Okay? Another diminished fifth is a B to F. So we can do the same thing to minor intervals. If we lower a minor interval by a half step, we end up with a diminished interval. So C to B is a major seventh, right? It had 11 half steps. And C to B flat would be a minor seventh, right? It's 10 half steps. So if we make B double flat, we're lowering that by 2 half steps. We end up with a diminished seventh, or 9 half steps. Okay, so let's listen to that. So now the sound of that is the same thing as a major sixth, but the major sixth could only be called a major sixth if we had written A natural. A natural is the same pitch as B double flat, because as you can see, B natural, 1 flat, 2 flats brings it to this key, which is A natural. But because we didn't write it as A natural on the staff, it cannot be called a major sixth. It can only be called a diminished seventh. Okay? So, but it sounds the same as a major sixth. And I want to now show you once again the chart that shows you the relationship between major, minor, and diminished and augmented.